There we go. Rock opera. Andrew Lloyd Webber, I believe, who's Jewish, not Christian, but it's rock opera in the 70s, I think. One of my favorites. I love opera. I love rock, so the two come together. I hate it when they try to update it because it's just so kind of 70s and late 60s. You know, just leave it alone. You know, yeah, they use words like groovy and stuff like that. But whatever. Yeah, Jesus wouldn't play. Sometimes people wanted Jesus to play and do his tricks, but he wouldn't do them. Get out of my life! Not you, Mr. Kazin. I'm just talking to Jesus. Good. Oh, okay. There you go. Okay, good to see you all. I noticed that I changed the schedule as I kind of intimated like a week or so ago. I finally got around to it. Sorry for the delay, but so follow the schedule. That will be the final schedule now for the end of the course, just to cram stuff in, I guess. Do the readings. If you haven't done Codell, you can just skim it. A lot of what is in the Codell reading we're already doing in class, but if you want to just skim it, then that's fine. But certainly, do the readings, I think, for Binz's book, the last few chapters, and the biblical readings. I'll focus on what are the main, instead of trying to cram in the whole Bible, I'm just going to focus on the two main hearts of each of the scriptures. And the heart of the Old Testament will be the Pentateuch, and the heart of the Christian scriptures will be the Gospels. So start reading those things, please. You don't have to wait for them. I mean, you can, but take a look at them, please, or start reading them. And they're not very long. The only long thing is the Gospel of Mark, and even that's the shortest of the Gospels. It's 16 chapters. It's not too long. And you can listen to it. You don't have to read it. You can find MP3 files on the internet and listen to it as you commute or do whatever. And you can actually get through it probably pretty quickly that way, just listening. And the same thing with the Pentateuch as well. How far did I get? Well, I started talking about this. Yeah. All right, good. Now, let's see. The exile. The Babylonian captivity. The Babylonian exile. All right, I was talking about. This is a very formative period, very important period in the history of the Jews and of Israel and of the Bible. Because as I already showed you that certain things start to develop amongst the Jews, okay? They become, this is where, you start to see the Jewish religion that we would recognize now, a real forceful belief in one God only, don't worship other gods. Celebration of certain feast days like the Passover, circumcision, circumcising your male children, following all the laws and the rules that are found in the Pentateuch. Okay, these become really a focus during the exile. Remember, before that, it's a little bit messier, as I've described to you already. And we see that in the Bible, in the writings of the Bible. What did I want to say? Oh, for the history of the sacred writing. So, they're led into exile, and I guess my point is this: they encounter God afresh in a different way in the exile, because they have to reflect on why it happened to them, why this great disaster happened to them, why their God allowed this to happen. Okay, so they encounter God in the exile. God speaks to them, and now they're willing to really kind of listen in a different way. They've hit rock bottom. Everything's over. The game is over. Okay? And so they need to regroup and reflect. One of the things that seems to start happening also in the exile, and especially after the exile, is the sacred writing, the stories that they've been telling and passing along about their people start to be collected and written down. So we believe that, it's during the exile that we start getting the Pentateuch formed and written and interpreted. It's now interpreted, the whole Pentateuch. And a lot of the stuff in the Old Testament is now reinterpreted in light of the exile. So you have the old scriptures mixed in with newer ones, and this new reality, or this new, I should say, not reality, what's the word I'm looking for? Realization, okay, of the relationship with God, right? So we see that already, that kind of reinterpretation going on. As I showed you before when we talked about the patriarchs, and I talked about, Abraham was given the law of circumcision, yes? Or was he? Because Moses was a Jew and he wasn't circumcising his children. Wasn't he supposed to if he was a Jew? Wasn't he following the law, the covenant that God made with Abraham, that all people will know you by your circumcision? At least would know the men. They didn't do it to the women. So that has to be written back into Abraham's story. It also has to be explained in Moses' story because he wasn't circumcised. And remember, his wife has to circumcise him because God attacks him. So this probably happened during the exile. Some editor, some later person had to explain these ancient stories in the light of their newfound understanding that, yeah, we should have always been doing this. And you know what, Ms. Bolton? We always kind of were, Abraham did it, Moses did it. No, they didn't really do it, but we write it back into the story as if they did do it, because they were good Jews too, and, they should be, they're an example to us, Eventually, the exile does end. 539 BC, the Babylonians are invaded. Use my map again. The Babylonians are invaded. Okay, remember we had the Assyrians up here. They fell to the Babylonians, and the Babylonians had this region for a while. But then Persia arises, an empire called Persia in modern-day Iran. Okay? And, Iranians are still very proud of Persia. They're very proud of Persia. They still think the empire hasn't ended, but anyway. And it's under a man named Cyrus, who was also mentioned in the Bible. It's mentioned in the book of Isaiah. It's a prediction that God will send his Christ, called Cyrus. That's interesting. Cyrus is described as a Messiah. And Cyrus he attacks Babylon and destroys the Babylonian Empire. And Cyrus is apparently a very wise, tolerant leader, more tolerant than, for the period of time that he's living in, he's more tolerant than other leaders. And he allows people who have been exiled and taken into slavery by the Babylonians to return to whatever lands, if they want to, they don't have to, return to their lands that they came from. Okay? And some of the Jews do. Maybe many of the Jews do. But some of the Jews don't. Okay? So for a long time, long time, even into modern history, you always had two groups of Jews, two Jewish communities. You had a Babylonian Judaism, those who decided to remain. But then you had the Jews that went back to Israel, back to Palestine. So you had a Palestinian Judaism. Okay? You also had two Sanhedrins set up for each group of Jews. Okay? So some went back, a lot of them went back to their homeland, their promised land. The fact that in the book of Isaiah, Cyrus is mentioned, if it's not a prediction, it could be Isaiah the prophet, but a lot of scholars think that he was dead by then, and that this prediction of Cyrus is actually written during the time of Cyrus. There's another prophet who uses the name of Isaiah. He's not Isaiah. He was carried into exile, and he lives in Babylon, and he's predicting that Cyrus the Persian will overthrow the Babylonians and allow them to return home, which happens. So it is kind of a prediction in a way, just probably not by Isaiah. We don't know who this prophet was. They call him, I think it would be Trito-Isaiah, third Isaiah, which is in the third part. Chapters 55 to 66 in the book of Isaiah are derived from him. One of the worst mistakes I ever made in my life was when I was taking a doctoral course on the history of biblical interpretation. We talked almost nothing about the history of biblical interpretation, so I'm not sure what I learned in it. But I remember the professor was a nice guy, talking about the prophet Isaiah and how he didn't write certain sections, or he wrote this and couldn't have written that, or something like that. And I was just being a jerk. I was kind of like, just said, well, maybe he did write it all, and that was one of the worst mistakes. I got a severe lecturing, because he was an expert, you know. He knew Hebrew and had studied Isaiah. He's like, you're telling me that Isaiah wrote all of Isaiah when I know what I know? And no, and then I started dancing. I'm like, no, what I really meant, Professor, was... And I got out of that, oh, I see what you're saying, which is not really what I was saying, but I made him believe it. This one right goes, I'm not going to lose any sleep over it. If it was all Isaiah, if it was 3 different people, I don't care. Anyways, so we have this, what's called the Cyrus cylinder, because it's a cylinder. It's a stone cylinder on which, and here we have cuneiform, ancient cuneiform. Yes, we learned about cuneiform, didn't we? Wedge-shaped letters, in which is written the decree of Cyrus, which is mentioned in the Bible. The Bible, kind of tweaks it a bit. It's not exactly the same, but we do have evidence here in the cylinder Cyrus, or the cylinder Cyrus, the Cyrus cylinder, which would have liked if I had put some in my notes, but I don't think I did. I forget when they discovered it. But anyways, which basically does say, yeah, people can return home. It doesn't say anything about the Jews in specific. But if you read the Bible, the book of Second Chronicles, then it does. Cyrus says, Jews, go home and rebuild your temple, Okay, Cyrus probably didn't say that, or at least he doesn't say that in the cylinder that we have. But he does say, people can return home to wherever they were. And so the Jews saw that as divine intervention. And so they do. Some return home. Oh, I want to talk about that too. Or maybe because I didn't put Ezra here. No, there he is. Okay. Then they return home, and things are obviously in disarray. People apparently hadn't rebuilt anything. Jerusalem was still pretty much in ruins. The temple was in ruins, even in 539, after like 70 years of exile. But when they return, they decide, okay, we got to rebuild Jerusalem. We need to rebuild the temple, and this newfound faith that we have, we need to rededicate the temple and start up all the sacrifices as we're supposed to be doing and worshiping our God. And so a figure arises called Ezra the scribe, a theological expert in the community, kind of like a rabbi, but he's called Ezra the scribe, who is a major historical figure for the Jews for basically refounding and establishing this kind of new form of Judaism, this new understanding back in the Holy Land, because that's not what was going on back in Palestine. When the Jews come back, they're kind of shocked by what they find, that the people haven't really kept the faith, or at least they haven't realized what they realized in Babylon, The the Jews who are living there have kind of intermarried with the local pagan groups. They don't have Jewish wives. The Jewish men don't have Jewish wives. They've taken foreign wives. They're still worshiping on the high places. They're worshiping Yahweh, yeah, but they're also worshiping the other gods and goddesses and stuff like that. So they're doing all the things that got them sent into exile to begin with. So the Jews that come back have to change this. They have to kind of convert their own people. And this story is told in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. You have 2 books called Ezra and Nehemiah that are, telling the same story basically, about this man Ezra, what he finds when he comes back. And he flourished, Ezra, in the 5th century, 465 to 359 BC. 465 to 359, we think, are his dates. And he is so important to Judaism that he's called the father of Judaism. This is where you really get Judaism, because it's from the people who were exiled from Yehuda, from Judah. That's Judaism. We don't know what happened to the northern tribes. They're gone. Or they're Samaritans. If you want to look to what the ancient Jewish religion is, maybe you want to look at the Samaritans, although, Anyways, so Ezra is called the father of Judaism. And in Jewish writings, this is Tosefta Sanhedrin, which if you take world religions, you'll learn what these various Jewish writings are. the Tosefta. What is a Tosefta? What is it? It's the addition to all of the oral tradition from Moses that was passed on to the Jews of all the interpretations of the laws and stuff like that. And then a group of people added on their own additions called the Tosefta, okay? And more additions were added on later on. But in the section dealing with the laws regarding the Sanhedrin, how the Sanhedrin should work, who should be a part of it, how you conduct a trial against somebody, all this other stuff. They have this statement about Ezra. Ezra was worthy for the Torah to have been given to him, had not Moses come before him. Okay, so Ezra is seen as such a great figure that had not Moses come first, beat him to it, God would have given the law to Ezra. That's how great a figure he is. Okay, because Ezra, also a priest and scribe, but he's also a priest. When he returns, he starts the observance of the law. He gives them help in rebuilding Jerusalem and the temple. I don't think did we have a reading here from, I think, Nehemiah? Did I give you a reading from Nehemiah earlier on when I was talking about magisterium in the schedule? I thought I did. I know I did in the other course, Mr. Marita. Don't know if anyone read it. I'm assuming you did, Mr. Marita. I'm not judging, okay? No. Oh, sure. I thought I did when I talked about magisterium. Well, anyways, there's an episode, I think in the book of Nehemiah, where Ezra stands up and all day reads out the law to the people so that they know what rules they're supposed to follow. And the people start crying and weeping. And it might be because they're sad that they didn't know. We didn't know we were supposed to do all these things. When I read it, I kind of look at it like, oh, damn, we got to do all these things? They start crying, But, they send out Levites amongst the crowd to say, don't worry, this is a happy day, The people are like, oh. Anyway, so he brings back the observance of the law. He begins the rebuilding of the temple. And there's the belief that amongst Jews that he founded what's called the Great Sanhedrin in the Holy Land in Palestine, the Great Council of Religious Experts, so that they could give legal opinions. I mentioned the Sanhedrin. Another idea that percolated up during the exile and also starts to become very popular afterwards amongst the Jews is the idea of the Messiah. I know it says we'll talk about this later, but I purloined this PowerPoint from Christian Faith. So yes, in Christian Faith, I'll talk about it later. I'm going to talk about it now here because it's a big interpretive key, because the Messiah also gets written back into the older writings, okay? I don't think Abraham knew about a Messiah because there was no kingdom yet. It's the king of Israel, okay? Remember, God promises David, I think I told you this, I'm pretty sure, that his kingdom will not end, right? He'll always have a descendant on the throne of Judah. Well, that obviously doesn't happen. Judah is destroyed. First it's taken over, then it's annihilated by the Babylonians. And the Davidic kingship is ended. So what are we to make of God's promise? God didn't know that this was going to happen, or God was making a promise that he couldn't keep? Well, no, he's God. He does keep his promises. So it's reinterpreted in a futuristic way, not that it's the materialistic way. It is kind of interpreted materialistically in a way. That this God must mean the future. A future descendant will come in the line of David to reestablish the kingdom of Judah and to gather in all the Jewish people again into this one kingdom. And this is an anointed one, a Messiah. I went over Messiah already, didn't I? I talked about, yes, Christ and Messiah mean the same thing. Anointed one to smear or rub with oil. Okay? And the kings of Israel had oil poured over their head as part of their initiation ceremony. So they were called anointed ones. All right? Messiahs. So there's this anointed one, a king, a ruler, a Messiah who's going to come in the future. Whoops. I did that for it. All right. There's this anointed one who's going to come in the future and will reestablish all things. And I thought that I was going to give you, maybe I have to go to the other PowerPoint rather than this one to give you more information. Sorry about that. I'll have to add it to this PowerPoint. Christian faith. Jesus. I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. I already have this all. All right. Oops. There we go. The Messiah, and here's your definition of what the Messiah is. A descendant of David who would come at the end of time, see, futuristic, who would reestablish the kingdom, defeat the enemies of Israel, okay, no more invasions by other foreign groups, establish a reign of peace based on the faithful observance of God's law. Okay? The word Messiah comes from the Aramaic word. It's not a Hebrew word. It's a related language called Aramaic, which the Jews kind of picked up in Babylon, called Meshicha. Meshicha. In Hebrew, it's Mashiach, which means exactly the same thing. Mashah means pour oil on. Right? Now, again, this is a developing idea. It's not a clearly described idea in the Old Testament. Okay? But writings from the period state a belief in a coming future ruler who would establish a free Jewish nation. He's a king savior. He's a king who would save the people of Israel and defeat their enemies so that the Jews could live in peace. That. Oh, there it is, right there. So it's a later development that also comes out and derives from this period of exile. Because again, they have to make sense of God's promise that the kingdom would not end. Well, it did clearly end. Okay? And so they reflect on that. But there was division. There was not a unity about what the Messiah would be, this anointed one would be. Okay? There were, even during the time of Jesus, there were different and competing ideas about what this anointed one would be. Right? The Christ. Okay, so I just put this on here. It's Christ, right? Which means the same thing. Chrio in Greek means to rub with oil. So Christ is just a translation of Messiah. So when you say Jesus Christ, you're basically saying Jesus Messiah. It just means the same. Don't worry about this. I go into this. This deals more with Christian faith, and we don't need to worry about that. You need to worry about it, Mr. Marita. It is not. It is not. I should have added this, but I didn't think to add it. I will add it to the PowerPoint for this class and re-upload the new one. So sorry about that, but thank you. King David, yes, okay. I did that, and I mentioned Psalm 89. So I go over it more in detail, and maybe I should go over Psalm 89 since we're talking about sacred writings. Do you want me to go over Psalm 89 or no? Little prop two poll. Who wants me to go over Psalm 89 or move on? Ideas. There were three general ideas of what the Messiah would be. You know, there was a political view, a spiritual view, an apocalyptic view. Okay? The political view is maybe the more traditional view of a warrior king, a king savior. The Messiah would come back and would kill all of the enemies of the Jews and reestablish a peaceful kingdom for the Jews to live in forever. It would never end this time, all right? So, you know, the Messiah is like a liberator, a political liberator. The spiritual Messiah, which some viewed the Messiah more as a kind of priestly figure. And some even talked about there were two types of Messiah. There was a Christ of David, a Messiah of David, the political Messiah, and some groups of Jews talked about a Christ of Aaron, the high priest. There was a priestly Messiah who would come, who would reestablish, the proper following of the law of Moses amongst the people, would reunite the Jews with in their faithfulness to their God. And then there was a futuristic, apocalyptic or eschatological. We talked about this before when we talked about the anagogical, yes, the anagogical sense of Scripture, also called eschatological, the end times, eschatos, and eschatological, Mr. O'Neill, yes, or apocalyptic, which would be more of a prophetic figure, a prophet sent by God who would bring about the end of the world. This reign of peace, of God's peace. Not maybe a physical kingdom, but more maybe a spiritualized kingdom of peace for the Jewish people. And you have this tradition also kind of in the Old Testament of, God promising a prophet like Moses to come. Predicting that a prophet like Moses, or the prophet, she feels better. I'm assuming she's not feeling well because she has the mask, but a prophet like Elijah, this man Elijah that I mentioned before when we talked about Ahab and Elijah the prophet and in the book of Kings, like a prophet Elijah who's predicted to come at the end of the world. This prophet like Moses, a eschatological prophet, and Jews still believe in this. Okay, at the Passover they leave a chair empty for Elijah and the door open, because they don't know when they want to be ready when he comes. So this is an old belief. We see it even at the time of Jesus. There was this belief 2,000 years ago that Elijah would come like the Messiah and would bring about the end of the world. And the Samaritans that I mentioned before, they have also this belief of a Messiah as well, like the Jews, and that's their belief. They don't describe him as a king, or the Messiah for them is a prophet like Moses. So they preserve that belief. How does this help us with our encounter with the sacred writings? Well, it helps us an understanding. So for example, let's just give you one immediate example. Go to the book of John. First chapter of John, verse 19.
It's the first chapter of John.
Yes, chapter 1, verse 19.
Is it the gospel or is it First John?
Oh, that's a good question. The Gospel of John. Yes, I could have meant the letter of John, right? Or one of the letters. Yeah. The Gospel of John, excuse me. Maxwell.
Just can't find it. I just...
Okay. Who's got it? Who wants to read it, beginning with verse 12?
Came back, finally.
Who wants to do the reading?
Is it John 1, chapter 19?
John chapter 1. Did I say verse 19 or verse 12?
It's 19.
It's 19? 19. We'd like to begin reading. Go ahead, Mr. Covey.
And this is the testimony of John, when the Jews from Jerusalem sent priests and Levites
Levite, good.
to ask him, "Who are you?" He admitted and did not deny it, but admitted, "I am not the Messiah." So they asked him, "Where are you then? Are you Elisha?" And he said, "I am not." "Are you the prophet?" He answered, "No." So they said to him, "Who are you? So we can give an answer to those who sent us. What do you have to say for yourself?" He said, "I am the voice of one crying out in the desert. Make straight the way of the Lord." As Isaiah the prophet said, some Pharisees were also sent. They asked him, "Why then do you baptize if you are not the Messiah, or Elijah, or the prophet?" John answered them, I baptize with water, but there is one among you whom you do not recognize. The one who is coming after me, whose sandal strap I am not worthy to untie. This happened in Bethany across the Jordan, where John was baptizing.
Okay, excellent. We have no idea where that was. Thank you, John, for giving us specifics, but unfortunately, we lost where that is. But anyways, it was somewhere on the Jordan River, near some town. But notice the Sanhedrin, the religious authorities, apparently hear about this guy doing a weird thing, which is dunking people in water, which is very weird, choosing to do that, and claiming a message, apparently of renewal, Jewish renewal. And so they go to test and see what's up, who are you? What's your authority for the things that you're doing? And the first thing he said, well, I'm not the Messiah. I'm not the Christ. Okay, you're not the Christ, which could be in the sense of the political Messiah, because they do ask him, well, are you Elijah then? Or are you the prophet who is to come? That's another term that's used. Are you the one who is to come? Okay, which I don't know where you fit that in with the idea of the Messiah. Maybe the spiritual Messiah is what it's referring to, but whatever. But at least two of the ideas are present there. The idea of a political Messiah and the idea of a prophet Messiah coming. And he said, no, I'm none of these things. So what are you? Well, and he quotes scripture. He said, I'm the voice crying in the desert. Okay? So he doesn't even identify himself really as a prophet either, but he is the fulfillment of prophecy. Isaiah the prophet prophesied this. I am the voice crying in the desert, make straight the path of the Lord. So he's proclaiming the Lord, okay, which for Isaiah is God. Make straight the way of God, okay, God's way straight, not bumpy, not level. So God doesn't stumble and fall, I guess. Well, he is an old man in his belts, so, I don't want to be ageist, but, when you get older, your balance is not what it should be, and never know, the Lord might need some help. Maybe a scooter, hover around. Make straight the way of the Lord, but he makes clear which Lord he's talking about, because he says, I'm baptizing with water. There's one coming after me that I'm not worthy even to touch his shoes. Which, if you know the Jewish culture, and still to this day, it's a custom in Arabic culture that the feet are considered very dirty and unclean. And so to touch a person's feet was, or for someone to take off their sandal and slap you or throw it at you is a grave insult because it's dirty. So I'm not even worthy to do that. I'm not even worthy to touch this person's sandal. That's how unworthy I am, is what he's saying. He's making straight the way of the Lord, who for Isaiah is God, but for John, it's Jesus. That's interesting. And he's not the Christ. Okay, then who is the Christ? Because he seems to be acting like the Messiah, at least from the perspective of these priests and Levites that come from Jerusalem. The Jews from Jerusalem, which is kind of another way of saying the Sanhedrin, the Jewish authorities from Jerusalem. They want to know what he's doing. I could also say just one other thing about this, that I am the voice of one crying out in the desert, make straight the way of the Lord. He quotes the scripture, but if you read the Gospel of Mark or looked at the Gospel of Mark, that's how Mark begins his gospel. He says, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written in Isaiah the prophet, behold, I'm sending my messenger ahead of you. He will prepare your way. A voice of one crying out in the desert, prepare the way of the Lord and make straight his paths. Actually, this is a conflation of two different prophecies. One part is from Isaiah. The other part, if you look at your footnotes, is from Malachi, actually, the prophet Malachi, where he's predicting the coming of the prophet Elijah, which Mark here applies to John the Baptist. Ooh, that's interesting. But he doesn't put it in the mouth of John the Baptist. John has John say this and quote this scripture. But in Mark, it's just quoted as a prophecy that's fulfilled by John, apparently. So you see how, like, the early Christians were reinterpreting the Old Testament through their encounter with Not just Jesus, but John the Baptist, his forerunner, who comes before him, who's this guy John the Baptist, the baptizer. Right? So they interpret it in different ways and use it in different ways. To say the same thing about John, really, that he's a forerunner. He's a voice preparing the way, telling people to prepare themselves for the one who is to come, who is not him. Finally, there was, I guess we could say, a fourth conception of the Messiah, which was the big nada, Ms. McGowan. There were Jews who believed nothing. There were Jews who had no belief in the Messiah at all. They just didn't share that belief. Yeah. So you have a multiplicity of views of the Messiah, which might explain why Jesus is so hesitant to talk about it, okay? And call himself outright the Messiah, because there were so many different views about what it was. And as it turns out, we'll get to Jesus in a moment, I think, maybe. His conception was perhaps different than what they were expecting. Okay? I'll talk about that another time. Not for this class. Yes. Certainly nobody was expecting a Messiah who would suffer for the sins of the people and die for them. We don't have any evidence of that in, Jewish literature from the time before Jesus or the Jewish writings in the scriptures. We just don't have that. That doesn't, we can read it back into, like if you do the extra credit and you read Isaiah 53, sometimes the church will reread that and see kind of a prophecy in Isaiah, also in Psalm 22, a prophecy of the crucifixion. You have pierced my hands and my feet. Okay, what else could that mean? Literally the Hebrew says, you have dug into my hands and my feet. No one was expecting this. The Messiah would be a failure. The Messiah was supposed to be victorious. Okay? So when Jesus does fail, his followers it's kind of like the Babylonian exile. We have to reflect and rethink, what does this mean? But he defines their encounter with the sacred writings, because even the idea of the Messiah has to be reinterpreted in light of Jesus for the Christian. Jesus is your encounter even with the idea. You encounter it through what happened to him. To us, we don't think about it, because even if you're an atheist, we live in a Christian milieu and culture, so we just kind of go with it, I think. And no one seems to give a second thought that, Jesus died on the cross, Jesus loved us, and don't see actually the cross for the great shameful failure that it was, that the early church thought it was, that his enemies thought it was. They thought it was their justification. Jesus, their enemy, had gotten his just desserts from God. He was punished. He was not the Messiah, precisely because he was crucified, from their view. All right, don't worry about this, don't worry about this, don't worry about this. Going back to the other PowerPoint. Okay, I put this picture on here because this is interesting just for archaeology and literary stuff. This is where we, as I said, with the exile, we get the Bible starting to be written down. And this is from, I think this is the Isaiah scroll. I don't know why I didn't put it on the PowerPoint, but anyways, the date, I think it's the 300s. Called the Isaiah scroll because this is the whole scroll. It's of the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah scroll, found in Israel in the 1940s. And I believe it dates from the 300s BC. And it's our earliest, I think the Isaiah scroll is our earliest evidence for the Jewish scriptures, Jewish sacred writings. The earliest written evidence going back, not for the whole Bible, but just for evidences of the Jewish writings, the oldest one. And we have fragments of other writings. We don't actually get our full Bibles until, about 1,000 years ago, actually, with our earliest copies, But we do have fragments of the sacred books from way back when, and this goes back to 300s, which would be just about, a couple hundred years after the exile. So you can compare stuff like this with later Jewish copies that we do have of complete Jewish Bibles, compare the Hebrew text and see if everything changes, been made, how accurate the tradition was passed on amongst pretty good actually. Although sometimes no, there are some significant differences sometimes, but a lot of times it's quite close to what they had hundreds of years before. So this is interesting, I think. Scroll of Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah. What else did I put on here? All right. Working our way to Jesus. Let me get my street. Just give me one moment here. Okay. Ezra starts the process, as I said, of reestablishing the temple, the second temple. As I said, this is called the Second Temple period. So obviously, eventually, the second temple is built. But it's a project, and it takes a long time. Okay. I don't think it was completed during the lifetime of Ezra, but he got the work started. And it was, again, an issue because people didn't want to rebuild the temple. They were trying to rebuild their lives, so they were focused on themselves. And so you see in like the books of Haggai, the prophet Haggai, in who else? Zechariah, I think. Urging the people on. Prophets have to arise and be sent by God to urge the people on and say, look, you're living in your homes happy, and yet the house of God is still in ruins. Get to work. All right. So these prophets like Haggai urge the people on. So even that process is talked about or represented in the Jewish scriptures. That issue for the community. It's interesting because in Haggai, if you read the book of Haggai, at the end of the book of Haggai, it mentions this guy called Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel, who was apparently, I guess, installed as the governor by the Persians to be governor of the province of Yehuda, of Judah, in the Persian Empire. Okay, so they put in Zerubbabel. He wasn't king, so they hadn't really technically established the kingdom of David. He was apparently a descendant of David. So that was significant for the Jewish community that they did at least have a ruler kind of in the line of David. So maybe they were seeing this as kind of like the first fruits of the reestablishment of the kingdom, the coming of the Messiah. And Haggai even goes a little bit too far in his prophetic statements about, calling Zerubbabel the signet ring of the Lord. It's like the God's ring, a signet ring, that you would use to put your official seal on letters and documents and stuff. Which is almost hinting like Zerubbabel is reestablished, is kind of like the Messiah in a way. Well, okay. Haggai was wrong, though. Because we don't know what happened to Zerubbabel. And Zerubbabel is also mentioned, I believe, in the book by the prophet Zechariah. So he apparently also had this idea that Zerubbabel is like the beginning of the kingdom again. The Messiah is coming away. Well, they were wrong. Because Zerubbabel just disappears into the mists of history. We don't know what happened to Zerubbabel. He certainly did not reestablish the kingdom. That just didn't happen. So apparently he was not the fulfillment of the messianic promises. But you see the hope developing in some of the prophetic literature that was written later after the exile, like Haggai and Zechariah. What happens then? They don't Persia is also destroyed. Persia falls eventually, the Empire of Persia, to Alexander the Great, I believe. A man named Alexander who came from northern Greece. You can't see it on here. Northern Greece was called Macedonia in those days. The biggest mistakes I ever made, another big mistake, Ms. Belts, that I ever made in my life, Mr. Marita, Mr. Plange, I was teaching a course, not here, at another university, and I made the mistake of saying that Alexander the Great was a Greek. And I happened to have a Macedonian student. Oh, I got an earful on that one. No, he was Macedonian. He was Macedonian. Well, nope, he was Macedonian. I'm like, okay. I wasn't going to go into it with him. You know, we were both right, you know. Okay, yeah, because there's the modern country of Macedonia, okay, above Greece, you know. She had all sorts of controversy with Greece because they wanted to call it Macedonia and Greece wouldn't let them. So now they're called the Northern Macedonian Republic. But I'm sorry, they're not related in any way to Alexander the Great. Okay, so Greece, the northern part of Greece, they were Greeks, spoke Greek, had Greek culture, Greek lineage. The modern day Macedonia that we know of now, Macedonians are Slavs that moved into the area in the 600s AD, you know, many, many centuries after Alexander lived, you know. So there's no connection. But, you know, if I can say that, you know, what's his name? If I can say that, you know, Antonio Cuipa is an American when he technically wasn't, you know, even though he was in Florida, yes, but it was Spanish territory, it eventually became Florida, and I can claim him as an American saint, okay. So the Macedonians, if they want to claim him, Alexander the Great, as a Macedonian Slav, go with God, my friends. Vaya con Dios. I'm not going to argue the point, but technically Macedonia was part of northern Greece, and that's where Alexander was from. And he does a campaign. He goes all the way over to India, and he gets a cold and dies. Fortunately, one of the very young man, but he's a great general, and he conquers this whole area of the Eastern Mediterranean, going all the way over to India. Of course, conquers the Jews as well, so they're under that power. And after the Greeks, you have the Greeks under Alexander, who dominate the Jews during this period and cause all sorts of trouble. And if you're interested in that, and these are the kingdoms that came after he died. Once Alexander died, they divvied up parts of his kingdom, of his empire. And so you had the Ptolemies who took Egypt, basically, and ruled there. Then you had the Seleucids, who ruled basically the Middle East and parts of Turkey. Greece was ruled by another guy, I forget what they were called. But anyways, the Seleucids caused all sorts of problems for the Jews by trying to impose Greek culture on the Jews, trying to put idols in the Jewish temple, getting Jews to no longer circumcise, not follow the law, and that causes a revolt. The Jews rise up, a group of Jews rise up. And if you're concerned about that story is also told in the Old Testament. You read the first and second books of Maccabees, which talks about those stories, about the revolt against the Seleucids, the emperors, and also they had problems with the Ptolemies, but the Seleucid emperors who were trying to impose pagan customs and Greek customs on the Jewish people. Okay? And they won, actually. For a brief period, the Jews were actually, these Jewish revolutionaries were actually able to establish the kingdom for a little bit, for a period of time. See my dates here. Is it 134 to 67? I got to get my dates right here. Give me a second. 141 to 60, or well, we should really place it there with. No, I guess it would be 164. Well, they didn't really reestablish it. Let's say 161. Say 161, or the dates are fluid here. I want to get the dates right. I know the date when it ended. I'm just trying to see what the date was when it started. Well, the revolt starts in the 160s BC. I'll give you that. The revolt starts in the 160s BC. And I'm going to say, I'll just go with 141. I could be wrong on this, but they do reestablish independence for Judah. It's not much, but they actually reestablish independence and establish another kingdom in a way of the Jews for a brief period, 141 to 63. If I'm wrong on these dates, I'll correct them later, but I think I'm right here. And so it's called the Maccabean period, the books of Maccabees, as I said in the Bible, the Maccabean period, because that's the name of, well, it's not the name of the family. The name of the family is called the Hasmoneans. They establish a dynasty. But one of the people who is leading the revolt is a man named Judas, Yehuda Maccabeus, or Maccabas, or something like that, which means, in Hebrew, it means Judah the Hammer. Judah the Hammer. And he and his father and his brothers helped start this revolt. And eventually, one of his brothers, I forget which one, is named king and also high priest. So he's both. He's king and high priest of the Jews. Messiah, anyone? The Christ of David, the Christ of Aaron. And so, he reestablishes the kingdom for a little bit. Not very long, because you see there's the date there, 63. In order to kind of protect themselves from further invasion, they need help. They're small, right? So the Jews decide to ally themselves with this new power on the planet that comes from, well, it's not even on the map here. We get a bigger map, which I don't think I have here. Let me see if I have a bigger map. Nope, I don't. So they decide to ally themselves for their own protection's sake with this new group of people who are a bunch of towns and villages that started to move out and to make alliances with other groups and tribes of people in Italy, and then eventually were going to dominate the Italian peninsula, and then began to dominate and spread out across the whole Mediterranean, the Romans. And they make all sorts of alliances and treaties with the Romans to protect them, which at times seemed like a good idea, but eventually it'll turn on them, because in 63 BC, as showed you, we're on the board already, the Romans will invade Palestine, Judah, and will take direct control of it for the most part. They do, they take control of it basically. They do install a king for the Jews, a man named Herod, who is not Jewish, by the way. And yet the Romans give him the title King of the Jews. So again, think of the Messiah, Messiah is supposed to be a king savior, the king of the Jews. And now the Jews have a kingdom, technically, and they have a king of the Jews, even though the Romans are really in charge. They're not really independent. Herod is chosen by the Romans. He's given the kingship. But the Romans, in a kind of little bit of screw you, choose a dude who's not a Jew to be the king of the Jews. So think about that when Christmas comes in another month or so, and you're at Mass, and they're reading like the Gospel of Luke, or they're reading Matthew, and they're reading the story of the birth of Jesus, or probably Luke, the announcement of Jesus. Jesus is going to be the king, son of King David, and take over the throne of David, his father. Okay? Well, what about Herod? Wasn't there a Jewish king on the throne already? How could Jesus be the Jewish king? Because Herod wasn't a Jew. And people knew it. That's how we know it. Because people mentioned it, and they hated Herod because of it. Herod the Great, he's called. You can see his dates. Actually, you can't see his dates. They don't give it to you on this, but I have his dates. King Herod, who lived from 74 or 73 BC until 4 BC. 74, 73 until 4 BC. I'll pass over that. It's interesting, though. Anyways, why is he called the Great, then? Well, usually historians call him the Great because he did great building projects all throughout Palestine and Israel, Judah, I should say. I should call it Judah, or Judea now is what the Romans called it, Judea, so I'll start calling it Judea. He built all sorts of stuff all over Judea. Even temples for the Romans, like pagan temples, which really, again, people hated him. Jews hated him for that. And so he did great things, great building projects. And he was a very savvy, intelligent leader. He knew how to stay in power and not get himself killed or assassinated. In 37 BC is when the Romans made him actual king of Judea, Rex Judeae. Okay, and it wasn't just a title. I mean, a Rex meant that Herod ruled Judea, even though the Romans were in charge. He was truly a Rex or a king, and had a lot of independence on what he could do. And he starts what's called the Herodian dynasty, named after him, of course. As I said, a lot of people hated him. One was his lineage. He was not Jewish. His father, Antipater II, was not a Jew. He was an Edomite. He may, actually, I should say, was not a Jew. He may have been Jewish. The Edomites were not a Jewish people. They were not one of the tribes of Israel. Okay, if we look at our map, we have our maps from earlier. Edom is down here, and the Edomites were not Jews, but they were forced later by King David. King David invaded and forced them to become Jews and accept the Jewish religion. Was it the Maccabees? I thought it was King David. Who was the Maccabees? I could be wrong on it. But anyways, they were forced to accept Judaism. That is accurate. Maybe his father was technically a Jew. I don't know if he converted as well. His mother definitely was not. She was from a completely different group of people that had no Jewish connection at all. His mother, Cypros. That's the problem for Judaism, because your Jewishness goes through your mother, not through your father. Okay, if your mother's a Jew, then you're a Jew by lineage, by ancestry. Your father has nothing to do with it. Okay, so his mother was not Jewish. So he was technically not a Jew at all. So here are his wives. Okay, this is not a full genealogy of or family tree of Herod the Great. I only want to concentrate on the important ones. His first wife was a woman named Doris. Or maybe that's going to be the name of my coffee cup. I don't know, Ms. Belts. We'll see what happens. But his first wife was a woman named Doris. But Herod knew the whispers about his lineage and the fact that he was not truly Jewish. He was not one of us, and yet he's being called King of the Jews. So he married this woman, Mariamne I, who was descended from the Maccabees, from the Hasmoneans, who did have some kind, well, certain Jews, but did have some kind of lineage also with connection with Davidic lineage. Okay, so you see what he's trying to do here. He's trying to connect himself with that. So he marries her. He also had other wives as well. And from them we get a whole bunch of people who are mentioned in the New Testament. Okay, Mariamne and Herod have Aristobulus, one of his sons, and his son has a wife. I don't know who she is. It's not important. Who has other Herods, Herod Agrippa, and they all go by like Herod, so it can be confusing at times, because people would just say Herod this and Herod that, and it does it in the New Testament as well. It refers to Herod, even King Herod at sometimes, and it's not talking about Herod the Great, it's talking about someone other of his sons. You have to be careful with that. So Herod Agrippa, okay, who also was declared king of Palestine, but later he's mentioned in Acts of the Apostles. Herodias and Salome and Herod Philip, who are involved in the death of John the Baptist, because he criticizes Herodias' marriage to one of Philip's brothers, or half-brothers, I could say, Antipas, Antipas. Does Antipas marry Herodias? Yes. Which was violating the law. It was kind of like incest. So, and that gets John the Baptist killed, because Herodias hates him. Archelaus was later. He's mentioned in the Gospel of Matthew. That's why Jesus, Mary, and Joseph will not return to Judea, because Archelaus, Herod's son, Herod Archelaus, is in control of Judea, and they're worried he might try to kill the baby Jesus. Philip is also mentioned. Another Philip. He doesn't play a big role. He's mentioned in Luke's Gospel, but Herod Philip. Okay, so and then others, Drusilla and Bernice, who are married to Agrippa II. They're all mentioned in Acts of the Apostles. Okay, so the Herodian dynasty is represented in the story of Jesus. We're getting into the New Testament times now. And one interesting thing that Herod, Herod was considered a collaborator with the Romans. People hated the Romans because the Romans were oppressive and overtaxed the people, and Herod collected the taxes, and they said he built pagan temples for the Romans and stuff like that where they could worship their false gods. So people did not like that. But one thing Herod did do was he rebuilt the temple. He made it bigger. He renovated the temple in Jerusalem. And it was still going on during the time of Jesus, all right? So when you see like movies of Jesus and stuff like that, and they show Jesus in the temple, and they show all this big, beautiful building and stuff, think of scaffolding, stones all over the place. You know how carpenters are, workmen. They throw their coffee cups are all, because this was a huge project, and it was not finished during the time of Jesus. It was only finished like 30 years after Jesus was gone, all right? In the 60s AD. So the temple was really kind of a mess during the time of Jesus. It wasn't this beautiful temple. I mean, it was beautiful, but, think of scaffolding and people hammering on stuff and sawing and doing all sorts of noise and chaos and stuff. Think of a construction site. That's why, when Jesus in the Gospel of John, think about his comment. When Jesus... in the beginning of the Gospel of John, he's in the temple and he says, "Destroy this temple and I will rebuild it in 3 days." Like, Jesus, this temple's been under construction for how long? And look how big a project it is, and you're just going to finish it in 3 days? Come on. Right, you Donald Trump? I'll solve the war in 24 hours. Jesus, come on, think of the context. Jesus is standing in this unfinished, renovated temple saying, "I'll get it done." Or when Jesus speaks of the destruction of the temple's under renovation. It's not even finished. And Jesus is already saying that it's going to be destroyed eventually. So it's like, okay, so what's the point of rebuilding it or renovating it? So these things are going on in the background. This comes from Herod the Great. He starts this renovation. Okay. Now we get to the time of this dude. Now we're getting into New Testament. Which are still really, for us, really could say they're Old Testament times as well. I mean, it's not like there's a really clear demarcation between the Old Testament and the New Testament. All right? Jesus is a Jew. Jesus comes right out of Judaism into Judaism. He's a Jewish baby, Jewish parents. There it is. 167. I do have the dates. Sorry about that. 167 to 63 for the Maccabean Revolt and Independence. Put them to 167. So correct your notes, not 141. That might be the official time they got independence, 141, but it extends all the way back to 167. 167 to 63. Yes, Maccabeth, the hammer. Judas the hammer. I've got to get to Jesus. Will I get to Jesus? Maybe a little bit. Yeah, Nehemiah Acts chapter 8, or Nehemiah 8. That's right. I'm sorry, sir? Oh, yes. Why does it say 6 BC? We'll get to that in a moment, sir. Yes. I'm just trying to get to my my notes here. Okay. Jesus of Nazareth, who was born around 6 BC and died around 33 AD, and of course rose again, the belief is. I believe that, certainly. So this begins what we can call the New Testament period for Jewish history. We're still talking about Jewish history, Mr. O'Neill. There really is no change. This Jewish man emerges or arrives, appears amongst the Jewish people. Why is it 6 BC? Well, before Christ, yes, before Christ. Well, just because our calendar was developed in the 5th century, the 500s, I believe, the 6th century. I went over this, right, when I talked about BC and AD, right? I thought I already went over this. Dennis the Short, yes. Dennis Exiguus, no. Some people are nodding, but some people are giving me a stare like, no, Dr. Dunyan. I thought I did. I know I did in the other class, but I don't know if I did it in this class. I did talk about BC and AD, the Anno Domini and before Christ. Okay, well, just to make a long story short, there was a monk. I'm not going to give you all the details. There was a monk who lived in the 6th century, that is the 500s AD, who created our modern calendar. Okay, he wanted a way to date events. And so he wanted to date them from the time that Jesus was born. And so using historical records of his day that he had about the periods in which Roman emperors lived and how long they were emperor and other historical events that they could kind of date, he basically back-engineered his calendar. He worked back and back and back until the time when he believed that he arrived Jesus. And he was pretty good. He got, according to, and he created our modern calendar. So he's the one who came up with the idea of Anno Domini, the year of the Lord. He wanted to date the calendar by the years since the Lord was. Okay? So the first year of the Lord is year 1. There is no year 0. It's 1 Anno Domini. And now we're in 2024 years since Anno Domini. Actually 25, but it will turn over on January, New Year's Eve. Since that, so how can it be before Christ? Well, he didn't think of the time before Christ. He didn't give any name to that. That comes later. Someone decides to say the time before will be before Christ. So that comes later. When that's added on, now we kind of know from details about Jesus in the Gospels, who was historical figures who were apparently alive when Jesus was born, that he couldn't have been born in the year 1 as this monk thought. He was off by a few years, okay? It's pretty good given the materials he had to work with. He just had to keep all these things in his head and figure stuff out and do the math. But he was off by a few years. So scholars generally agree that Jesus was born about 6 years before he technically was born, according to our modern calendar in the West. All right, and then he died, or his ministry ended somewhere in the 30s AD. Okay, it's a rough guess. Okay, why do we think this? Well, because when you hear the story at Christmas, and this information comes to us both from the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke, so you have double testimony, historical testimony, that King Herod the Great, was alive when Jesus was born. Okay? So, Ms. McGowan, when did Herod the Great die? Mr. Plange, when did Herod the Great die?
I guess at the time of Christ's birth, maybe. No.
Okay, sir. Yes. It's kind of like saying, well, he died when he died, It's like, yeah, of course it's right. Yeah, if I just told you Jesus was born. What did I just tell you? I just wrote it on the board. 4 BC. 4 BC. So if Jesus was born when Herod was alive, it has to be at least 4 BC. Okay? And if you read the story like in the Gospel of Matthew, Herod tried to kill Jesus, the baby Jesus. And if the story is true, we don't know if the story is true. But if you go by that one story that we have, that Herod, Jesus apparently was already a toddler when Herod tried to do this, so he wasn't just born. So around a couple of years before Herod died, apparently, which gives us around 6 BC. So that's how we figure it out. And this jives with other information we're given. Like Luke tells us that the Roman emperor at the time was a man named Octavian, Caesar Augustus. Okay, so that confirmed, and Caesar Augustus was Caesar until 14 AD. So he was around that time. So, it's if we go by the gospel, if they're telling the truth, if they're not made up stories, if we find out they're fairy tales and they're made up, well, then we don't know when Jesus. But if we take them for their historical value, which most scholars do, even those who aren't Christian or don't read them as sacred scripture, then if Herod was alive, then Jesus, around the end of his life, is when Jesus was probably born. So that's how we get to the fact that Jesus was born before the time of Jesus. That's why I love history, Mr. Morita, because you can't make this stuff up. History is full of all these little curveballs, and so I love it. Fascinating little things.
It's just confusing because I thought he died at 33.
Yeah, he probably did, yeah.
Wouldn't that be like 39 or 40?
Yeah, could be. Yeah, see, again, we're going on the information from the Gospels. Only Luke, the Gospel of Luke, tells us when Jesus started his ministry. Luke says that Jesus was around 30 years old. So most people think it's 30. That's the tradition that people are told, that they grow up with. But Luke doesn't say 30. He says around 30. So Jesus could have been 28, 29. He could have been 31, 32. We don't know. So that's why it's circa 33 AD. So that's a rough ballpark estimate of when Jesus of Nazareth lived. Okay, I see you, Ms. Jacoby. I know I'm over, Ms. Wenrick, so I'll stop here, and we'll come back to talk about Jesus in the next class. And we should finish the biblical overview, I think. We'll finish with Jesus, because that's the New Testament, basically. Have a good day, sir. Did everyone get a paper on the schedule? It's online anyway. Mr. Kazin.
Thank you. For your weekend.
Oh, don't run away from me, Mr. Kazin. Nothing, you're fine. Just messing with you.
Oh.
No, you didn't do anything. Fine. You too. Have a good day, miss. Thanks. Okay. I don't think she did. You too, miss. Thank you. Feel better. Miss Miss Bolton, Donnelly, Jacoby. I think she said this if she wanted to. So I'll give her that. Mr. Kenton did. Hughes and McGowan. He did. He had his flag allowed, so give him that. Have a good day, sir. Cool. Hello, people in TV land.